This one on for you.
Yeah, that's good. Good evening, everyone. It is my great pleasure to welcome Meejin Yoon as our Dean's Forum lecturer at UVA this evening. Meejin is an architect, designer, and educator. She's the Gale and Ira Drukier Dean of the College of Architecture, Art, and Planning at Cornell University and founder and partner of Höweler Yoon Architecture, a multidisciplinary practice focused at the intersection of architecture, public space, technology, materiality, and landscape. Engaged in projects appearing or operating at multiple scales, from architecture and buildings to furniture, fashion, and installations on the one hand, and larger urban landscapes on the other, the practice explores the technological expansion of the discipline while underscoring the embodied experience of architecture, seeing media as material and its effects as palpable elements of architectural speculation. Their built projects exhibit a high degree of attention to space, materiality, and detail, while the more speculative projects rethink architecture's relationship to technology and performance, often proposing responsive and interactive environments that index, transform, and recircuit the material, affective, and energetic forces that condition architectural space in support of the public. For them, architecture is seemingly a performative milieu, registered as much by its effects as the mediating devices and forms that generate them. Meejin's talk tonight, Signal to Noise, recasts architecture as a broadcast mechanism, large impact and engaged form of public practice. What and how we design the public realm in a context of intensified urbanization, limited energy resources, and ubiquitous computing is critical. Her talk will focus on the integration of these cultural and technological shifts through a creative and cross-disciplinary practice. Meejin, of course, is also the architect for the Memorial to Enslaved Laborers, currently under construction adjacent to UVA's Rotunda. It is one of the most politically significant projects that UVA has undertaken in an attempt to confront its complex and very difficult history. I want to thank Alice Rauscher, who's here this evening, and her team, Connie, Sarita, and others, for leading this project, and also for Frank Dukes, past director of IEN, for its initiation. Meejin is author of Expanded Practice, Projects by Höweler Yoon, and My Studio, that was published by Princeton Architectural Press, and Public Works, Unsolicited Small Projects for the Big Dig, published in 2008. She's received many significant honors and awards for her work, including the New Generation Design Leadership Award by Architectural Record, the United States Artists Award in Architecture and Design, the Architecture League's Emerging Voices Award, and the Rome Prize, among many others. In addition to being widely published, her work has been featured in the National Design Triennial at the Cooper Hewitt in New York, the Museum of Modern Art, the Guggenheim Museum, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, as well as the Valencia Institute of Modern Art in Spain and the National Art Center in Tokyo, again, among many others. Before joining Cornell as the new dean, she was the head of the Department of Architecture at MIT. She received her Bachelor of Architecture from Cornell University and her Master's of Architecture in Urban Design with distinction from Harvard's Graduate School of Design. Please join me in welcoming Meejin Yoon.
Isla, thank you so much for that introduction, and everyone for being here this evening. I understand that there is a much more important event in a few hours, so thank you for coming this evening. I have been following Isla around, I have to say, for probably a decade and a half, and it's really an honor to be here. So I changed the title this morning from Signal to Noise to Rules of Engagement, and partly because I've been thinking a lot about rules lately. and specifically the rules of engagement in our physical built environment, in terms of both our discipline and our interactions with each other in public space. And this will lead up, I think, to the last project I will share, which is the Memorial for Enslaved Laborers here at UVA. So it's really a pleasure and an honor to be working on this campus and also to be lecturing here this evening. So I wanted to start with a great slide of public space in Hong Kong. This is Kowloon Park. And as you can see, the only thing you're allowed to do in this park is throw away your trash. And so I think these kinds of rules for how we understand our public spaces and understand really the public sphere, both as citizens and architects, is mediated by our context. In contrast, there's this amazing work. This is a wall drawing by Sol LeWitt, which is also a series of rules, but these rules are productive rules, they're iterative rules, and they're rules in which once they intersect with a specific site, if you follow these rules, it produces always a new work and a new drawing, in fact. And so in our public spaces, we also have rules of engagement, and often these are social rules. These might be cultural, understood rules as well. And of course, as new technologies emerge, they also challenge or transform our rules of engagement. So I start with a really old project. This is a project by Vito Acconci called Following, where he's moving through the city with a very simple set of rules. He follows a stranger in public space until that person enters into a private space. And so Ayla referred to some really early projects, which I'll share, that took a stance, let's say, on this kind of public-private mediation or negotiation. This is the defensible dress, and so it really looked at public-private space parameters and one's cultural comfort zones. This is my partner Eric Höweler, who couldn't be here tonight, and as you see, this was done, 2001, and this is my attempt to negotiate my space in that context. And so that project, while very early and very small in scale relative to Liz Diller's folding shirt project, I think operated within a cultural institution. So this is at the SF MoMA. And in that place, one could create such a construct. I think the question for me was always more in the public sphere, how one creates this kind of mediated environment. So one of our early projects in 2004 called White Noise, White Light attempted to create a field in a really beautiful setting on one hand, but a very historic and sensitive setting, and created a field of fiber optic lights that as people move through that field, the field would respond. So the response is very straightforward. It's, sorry, there is sound here, but the response is very straightforward. The light gets brighter, and then a white noise emits as people move through the field. And the idea was that the public actually choreographs the piece, and it's never the same because the public never interacts in exactly the same way through this field. But what we learned was, so those images were staged the night before it opened to the public, and this is some footage from the night it opened, where it didn't behave at all like we had imagined, and that was really because people didn't want to move through the field. They preferred to linger and interact with each other. The other thing about rules of engagement is that they embody our values, and some of those are cultural values that affect our way of making or our material attitudes. This is an image from Bernard Rudofsky's book, Our Clothes Modern. He also wrote Architecture Without Architects. And in this image, he compares a kimono to a Western garment. And in the kimono, he shares the material efficiency of the design of the clothing, the garment, and how waist is taken up, but also size is mediated by the fold or the wrap, versus the Western garment on your right, where the kind of curvature and form-fitting aspects are kind of packed in to a bolt of cloth in order to also be efficient, but these kind of residual elements that are evidence of that negotiation. Back then, so this was also 2004, I thought this was kind of interesting and wondered if you could combine the absolute relentless material efficiency with the kind of curvature of form. So this is the Mobius Stress, which is simply a loop of cloth with two zippers that twist to unravel the garment such that it can be worn by the body in many ways. That project, I think, was the basis of another early work at the Guggenheim Museum, where I collaborated with Enrique Norton to design the Aztec Empire show. And this was the first time I realized that you can design via spreadsheet, and I'll get into that in a second. But the first thing we realized was it was a data management exercise. There were 500 artifacts. They were coming from over 24 different lending institutions. Each artifact had a different insurance criteria. That insurance criteria dictated whether it needed to be environmentally conditioned or behind glass or could be open in space. So the first thing we did was we lined up all the artifacts in the rotunda of the Guggenheim, and we learned that there was not enough linear footage. So we actually had to create surplus surface by creating a wall that undulated in and out. There were multiple curators, but the main curator, it was clear that we needed to develop a tool in order to work with the curator that allowed for him to move artifacts up to the very last minute. So we created a rule system where every artifact had its assigned parameters from its lending institution, and then also based on scale, that there would just be one simple ribbon wall that would split to create a kind of pocket for each artifact. And that those pockets would be completely tailored to the artifact's requirements. And this is pre-RhinoScript. This is like the old days where it was brute force in terms of how we got these tools to function in our engagement with, here in this case, the curator. And it allowed us to test different configurations for the curator until finally the sequence was set. The idea behind this inner ribbon was that it would engage the Guggenheim itself in a very specific way, that it would transform that kind of live, it's an acoustically live space because there's so many hard surfaces. And so this envelope was a really thick, deep, mute kind of inner envelope. And the thickness of the felt here is almost 1 inch thick. And then, as you can see, as you move up the rotunda on the various ramps, you can see every artifact has its custom location with the custom scale pocket and height, and whether it's behind glass or forward. And so in fact, it's the spreadsheet, I would say, and then the curator who really ultimately design the exhibition. Now, when we move into public space, there's often more challenging parameters that one has to negotiate and navigate. So this is a project in Phoenix, Arizona, where we were asked to create an outdoor public space. And you can imagine that's a very challenging thing to do in that context. And it was actually part of a transportation project. So we were hired through a kind of combination of an arts organization, City Arts, and the kind of transportation organization there. And the goal was to actually shrink the road. So it was a road diet project that shrunk the road to enhance the pedestrian experience. So it widened the sidewalks. And the goal was to create some spaces of respite to enhance that pedestrian experience. And the site that they gave us was really a traffic median that we were asked to transform somehow. So looking back, I love this image of the Zocalo. And you see the Mexican flag, and in its shadow, a lineup of little people who are gaining respite from the kind of sun and the heat of that wide, vast public space. So we thought maybe the best way to create a kind of public space would be to create a public parasol or a shading device, which could both create shade, but also maybe frame light in a different way. And so we aggregated a simple unit together, and this kind of open cellular unit would allow air to flow, but also create shade in the kind of critical moments of the day and critical times of the year where that shade needed to be maximized. And then similar to maybe the dress project, there was a goal for both material efficiency, but also structural feasibility. And so we were testing to what extent we were comfortable with kind of deflection, and in the material itself in order to minimize the thickness of the steel, both to save material and also, of course, save cost. So this is in that traffic median. There are solar panels on the cells of the canopy. And so during the day, they absorb energy, and at night, they illuminate, and they really do transform this traffic median. So I'll shift into the architectural scale a bit, but I think that those same parameters operate in the way we think about architecture. So we were asked by a client in China many, many years ago, maybe, 2006, 2007, if we would consider doing a more traditional project in the way he was thinking about it. He had been a developer who had done very progressive, adventurous architectural works. But he, after the Sichuan earthquake, wanted to do an architecture that he felt would embody a kind of Chinese-ness, is how he defined this. Like there would be a cultural resonance to this contemporary architecture with the courtyard house typology. So we said, sure, we would be very interested. But the site plan we received was something like this. We were Site G. This actually came by email. We missed it multiple times because the email was so cryptic. But essentially we said, well, we could take the courtyard house typology, formalize it in a way that created clusters of organization of spaces always around a courtyard. And we created what we thought was this kind of mat building courtyard pact project. And we were really excited by the kind of form that it created. And we went off to China to present among 7 other young architects equally excited to play with architectural form. And so what you see is a car crash of architecture, a very earnest, I would say, architects who are trying to negotiate this kind of desire to be both contemporary and the client's desire to have this cultural sensitivity without being, let's say, mimicking, let's say, the cultural history too literally, because the program was different, etc. So instead of firing all the architects, which I think the client really did want to do, he thought it would be better, I think, to educate us. So he sent us on a trip. He sent us to the Sichuan Gardens, and he said, this is the quality I am after, this kind of layered quality, this kind of set of organizations. And he made us march up the Ermei Mountains at the crack of dawn and experience this kind of incredible misty view. So we started again, or we did another iteration that really simplified, I think, the organization. It still had that awkward site, so we had to deal with all the government setbacks that were required on it. But organizationally, I think it became more clear as a project, and we finished our drawings, and we sent them off. And we didn't hear for many months, so we assumed the project died. But we got another email, and it said, "Dear architect, congratulations. Building is under construction. We've just cast the lower level." And by the way, we actually had to change the site. So this is a new site. And wouldn't you mind, please, mirroring your building, because we think it will fit just so much better on that site. So we mirrored the building, and then we did our third iteration, which actually improved the project a great deal. It became even more simplified, I think. We also noticed there were an awful lot of other projects that suddenly started to look like our project, but this is our context. So the project was kind of built at this enormous scale. It is a massively scaled exhibition hall in which the kind of courtyards have the outdoor activities, and then the exhibition circulation is around that courtyard. The building is trying to mediate 2 scales, I would say, the kind of large massing scale, but then also the kind of immediate architectural scale. So one of the requests of the client was that we use these small operable windows and not or minimize active cooling and heating. And so it's very passive in its technology approach. And so in order to mediate those scales, we created these giant window surrounds, which were originally designed in wood. But then we learned that wood was quite expensive, and the client suggested switching it to Corten steel. So we said, sure, that I think will work. And so there's this kind of rich steel, colored steel, which, is self-protecting itself. And then each of these kind of windows and their organization, I think, creates a contrasting geometry to the kind of massive surfaces. And there are many entries into the exhibition hall, and so we designed different sets of entries around. The other thing we thought is, what could we do in that context that we can't really do in the United States that would give it its cultural specificity and local specificity? And we decided to work with a local brick in the area. And one thing I forgot to share was, if you look at the elevation, sorry to go backwards, you can see that the bricks get darker towards the top. So this was not a aesthetic decision. This is simply the result of, as the bricks were made over this duration of time, they got darker, the actual brick unit, because there was no color, they were trying to match to, etc. So this is the natural color of the transformation of the brick production over time. When I first was there, I was like, is it wet? Or, I was trying to figure out what the reason was. So the brick was really the protagonist, I would say, in this project. And we wondered if its specificity could both be kind of cultural and universal. So we asked not exactly what does the brick want to be, but really which way does the brick want to be oriented? And so all of the bricks are oriented true north-south or true east-west, even though the building has many angles to it. To orient, I think back in the origination of the word orient was pointing east, and so we thought maintaining a real rigor to the orientation of the brick could give it some special quality. So all the bricks north-south are true, east-west are true, and so on the oblique, because the brick is still facing true north-south, east-west, it creates this variegated texture. So this is an orthogonal hitting an angled wall. These are two angled walls coming together. Creates this real incredible texture on some of the surfaces of the building. So I think there are, rules of engagement at different scales. So if we think about the American context and the single-family home post-war, it represented this kind of feature of the American household and family unit. And we were asked by a client to design maybe one of our first single-family homes. This is not the client, but this little cartoon is to share what was motivating the project, which was the client now had fully grown children who had left home. So they were empty nesters. And the program brief was to design a home that would bring their children back to live with them permanently. So that was the brief of the project. And so we went through many design iterations, and then the project stalled for many years. It's very hard to work on such a program brief. But I think it was this desire. So this client is first generation Korean. His children are second generation Korean. And so they really wanted this kind of more culturally generational kind of living arrangement where everyone would live together. So this project also kind of went quiet for a while until we got a postcard that their eldest son, they have a son and a daughter, their eldest son had a baby girl. So the house moved into design and construction. Now, what was interesting is that because of the rules in this area, it had to be designed as a single-family house when in fact they really wanted more of a multi-family type of house. The site is really beautiful. We call it the Bridge House. But what's interesting is it needs to flicker between what looks like a single-family house and something that really functions much more as a almost like an urban apartment or condo above and a house below. So the site is in McLean, has this incredible view, and we thought that the upper bar, which would be the residence of the son and the daughter and their spouses and their kids, that all we had to do was frame the view, and if we could succeed in not messing up this beautiful view, we would kind of succeed in terms of the architecture. We also wanted to create a window into that landscape for people in the neighborhood, but really also as a way of creating separation internally because we couldn't actually separate and create more than one interior envelope, contiguous interior envelope to meet the single family zoning rules. So there is a living room in between, which is really seen as an outdoor space that continues the landscape from the exterior to the interior to the exterior again, and becomes a kind of wide threshold between the kind of more private living and the grandparents' master bedroom suite. And then above, can see it has a kind of more urban, like their own roof deck in addition to those spaces. And then a little detail, a kind of knife edge detail that allows for self-shading during the summer months, but allows the kind of winter sun to move deep into the house and warm the space up. This project, we were really lucky to meet a fabricator who was willing to bend all of the exterior metal. And so the clients wanted no maintenance to this house. And so the exterior is metal. And then we fell in love with the metal fabricator because he was just so excellent at his craft. And then we started turning everything inside into metal. So this is a metal stair, which cantilevers out. And then this is the kind of horizontal metal shingles on the front of the house. So that's a single family house, and we recently started a project in Boston that is moving quickly into construction in a really sensitive area called the Back Bay, not the Back Bay, Bay Village, near the Back Bay. But Carol Willis once said the skyscraper is the machine that makes the land pay. And so I think these tall multifamily residential projects are negotiating between kind of finance, market, the need for housing, and certain housing types within the city. The challenge for this project was it's part of this very quaint, cute, historic neighborhood called Bay Village. Yet the building exists on what is called the High Spine on Stewart Street, where the buildings are actually much taller. But it is within the Bay Village historic neighborhood, and thus it has a very engaged neighborhood, and yet the kind of scale in that neighborhood really ranges from three, 4-story buildings to the taller buildings on Stewart Street. So one of the challenges was really how to break down the scale of this building. And we looked at it from both a kind of massing and a tectonic perspective. And could we really break down the scale so it wasn't as monumental as many of the other projects? But in fact, the scale is extremely, extremely large at almost 20 stories. So in addition to breaking down the scale, we thought maybe we had to really look more carefully at the envelope and the texture and the kind of neighborhood as well. And could we develop something of quality that would resonate with the neighborhood as well as the client? So we saw all of the kind of limestone in the area, its attention to detail, and we were wondering if this kind of fluted quality could help negotiate that envelope and give it not only a different resonance with the kind of contemporary and the past, but also be done in a fairly economical way, such that these pieces could be essentially a kit of parts. And because Boston has this challenge history with precast, we knew that we would have to detail it really, really carefully so that the precast didn't feel like heroic and defensive, but I would say kind of elegant and giving a kind of dynamism to the envelope with its texture. So we've been working a lot with the precast company who will be fabricating and installing the envelope. But, you know, all of that was well and good. We enjoyed doing that as architects. But the real rules of engagement were about the ground plane. So in Boston, there is no as-of-right construction or development at a certain scale. And so this project had to go through very intensive building approvals and neighborhood community engagement and approvals at that level as well. So I share with you the first plan, where you can see this big amount of retail space, that the portion of the building that's facing the neighborhood, which is on Shawmut Street, has all the services, trash room, et cetera, et cetera. And then Stewart Street, the main street, you're maximizing, of course, the retail frontage. And over time and many, many community meetings, I think the project became much better in terms of how it hit the street. So retail got a bit smaller, but what happened through the process was a realization that the building has to contribute to two scales simultaneously: the intimate neighborhood scale on the Shawmut side, and then the kind of super urban scale, let's say, on the Stewart Street side. So how could the tower really negotiate these scales became a question. And through that process, the change in program to provide two townhouses at the base that would work with the similar typology, but also create not a back to the building, but really two fronts at really different scales, was what I think transformed the project and allowed it to move forward. I am going to skip this project in China, but it's also in Chengdu. And the one takeaway that you need to know for this project is that it tries to erode its whole ground floor in order to create a connection between the lake and the public street. There's lots of drawings that show exactly that, but I'm a little worried about our time. Okay, so I'm going to talk now about the last two projects. So the first one is the Collier Memorial, and the last one will be the UVA Memorial to Enslaved Laborers. So the Collier Memorial is a project that was born out of a horrific tragedy in Boston after the Boston Marathon bombings. After the bombings, the Tsarnaev brothers went into hiding, but they were being chased. So the city went in a sort of self-imposed shutdown, as well as the infrastructure stopped. So there were no subways running, no trains running, no way to get in and out of the city while they were undergoing this manhunt. And during that period, the Tsarnaev brothers came to MIT, and they shot and killed a young police officer named Sean Collier. And it's, I think, the first shooting on MIT's campus. And after that tragedy, there was this incredible outpouring of grief. I think, in that instance, nobody really knew what to do. And so a kind of informal memorial began to form. And so the university put out a call to the whole community to ask for suggestions for the Collier Memorial. And there were many questions, like should it be a physical memorial? Should it be a scholarship? Should it be an award? Should it be the name of the street? And they asked a committee that was led by the provost and both colleagues of Sean, students who knew Sean, and faculty to develop some criteria around what this memorial should be. And they concluded that it should be a physical memorial. They, as a group, concluded that its qualities. So there was, in addition to this document that I received, which said, here's the document of all the community's ideas, and then the committee's ideas are, it could be a forest, that the notion of patriotism was really important, and so the request for an American flag on the site was part of the initial conversations. Sean really loved climbing and hiking, and one of his close dear friends suggested a kind of cairn or a stacking of rocks. And so as a designer, I wanted a spreadsheet, but there was no spreadsheet available like the one in the Guggenheim. And instead, there was just a lot of emotion and a lot of different ideas about both what Sean would like and what would be appropriate and what people felt a memorial should be based on references that we have in our cultural context about what a memorial is. But the thing that I gravitated to was like all these little buttons that said MIT strong. So this is coming when people are saying Boston strong, MIT strong. And so there's a question, what is strong in this context? Is it something brute and forceful? Or is it something else? And so the hope was to take all of these ideas and synthesize them in a way that would resonate across multiple metaphors and messages. And so MIT's motto is hand in mind. The hand is a kind of constructive, making, industrious element. And so could the memorial be, in a way, a kind of open hand? Could it have the kind of mark of patriotism without the symbolism of the flag and potential sense of nationalism? Because MIT is, of course, a very international community. So the idea was to create a kind of five-pointed figure that could oscillate between the kind of star and the hand, and located at the site of Sean's shooting. But instead of it being an object, the hope was that it could really be a space, or a gateway that could frame that site in a very specific way. So the black box here is a specific rock that we put in that location, and that's where Sean's patrol car was parked when he was shot. And the orientation of this five-pointed figure creates a window when you're inside the memorial straight to that location. And the other fingers are negotiating site parameters, but also trying to create a buffer to the loud street on Vassar. And then I thought it would be important to talk about strength almost literally, that strength comes from many pieces, many unique pieces working together. Those pieces need to be in equilibrium, and at any moment, of course, is a fragile system. So the memorial became about stacking these 32 blocks in perfect equilibrium. And we work with incredible engineers. We have 4 different engineers. John Oxendorf's on faculty at MIT. Nippers Helbig was one of the engineers as well. And I remember going to the first meeting with the contractor and showing the sketches. And he said, "Oh, no problem. We know how to do this. We'll cast it out of concrete. We'll, put up some slabs of granite." And I said, No. It has to literally work like a series of half arches, and it has to be in equilibrium, and these blocks are solid. So that represents 110 tons of stone. Some of the blocks are many tons. As I said, we had to negotiate below grade parameters. And so what you see is this duct bank that's bringing all the data and telecommunications to the computer science and artificial intelligence buildings at MIT. And so it was clear we couldn't have any load on that duct bank. And so there are piles that go about 30 plus feet down into the ground, mediate a complexity of infrastructure below. And then on top of that, we had to work with a design tool. This is a design tool ODB made for us that would allow us to design in real time and calculate the live load, the thrust, to know if the geometry in principle would work before the engineers went to testing and calculating if indeed those slight shifts in geometry had an impact on the structure. So very bizarre set of construction drawings. The blocks are solid granite. This gives you a certain sense of the scale. But one of the debates was because the blocks are working in equilibrium, what happens with lateral load? Like what happens in an earthquake when things are subject to forces? And of course, we didn't want this to happen. But the debate between the engineers is that it is very plausible that this could happen in this system because we didn't want to post tension, we didn't want to put in cables or reinforcement. And the argument was, the science was that basically if there was a crack that opened up or a misalignment that created a shift, just let's say one quarter of an inch, in this direction, or let's say 1 millimeter. 1 millimeter, it would have a 6 millimeter drop in the vertical direction. So you can see that's quite catastrophic. But me and my affirmative positivism said that, oh, no worries, we have technology, we have incredibly precise computer models. We have CNC tools that will be able to fabricate the stone fabrication down to millimeters of tolerance. So we could hit the 2 millimeters of tolerance that the engineers said we needed. Well, some of these blocks take 7 days, 3-hour shifts in order to carve, because they're literally creating an erosion, taking out material to the project. And what we learned was that the materials used to carve the materials, so these saw blades, were wearing at a rate that we could not calculate. And so the blocks that were coming off these giant, expensive CNC robot arms were not precise. And so we had to develop our own kind of system to check each of these blocks and notate them, and then made the decision that if, and they were also laser scanned, if the blocks were more than X amount off, we would actually modify the next block that we were modeling, because each block was being milled at a time. So that just meant we were kind of design fabrication mode in this kind of 24-hour cycle, measuring. And so in conversation, there was a debate about whether we needed dowels to accommodate for any potential tensile need in the structure due to lateral movement. So the decision was made to put in these stainless steel pins that would not be actually in tension until or unless they were needed in tension. That was a way to mediate the kind of purist need for the design of one engineer with the more pragmatic and risk-averse perspective of the other engineer. And so it was really, for me, fascinating to watch 4 structural engineers debate the best way to structure and engineer and construct the memorial. And I always believe that engineers operate with answers, like they know there's a right and a wrong, a better and a worse. But I learned, engineering is as much an art form as architecture, and there are clearly vastly different opinions which reflect, I think, our respective collective value systems. So we decided to use the memorial as a kind of research project. So the memorial was built on these scaffolds. The scaffold is actually supporting the memorial, the vault of stone in the beginning. And then we put little sensors or strain gauges between all of the cracks that were critical, or all of the joint lines that are critical, in terms of measuring if there was enough movement or displacement that we needed the tension members to work. So back to the premise, like we wanted a fully compressive structure, right? So these are the little strain gauges everywhere. So that scaffold is sitting on these giant scales. These scales are connected to a computer. And then the construction crew is lowering the scaffold 1 millimeter at a time over about a 5-hour period, allowing the forces of the load of the structure itself to move into the legs really slowly, really gradually, really incrementally, while we're watching those scales to see if there's any movement, or if all of those legs are taking the forces appropriately. And the good news to the end of the story is that the memorial is structurally sound. And it now exists on campus as this kind of rock landscape. And it mediates a bunch of different scales. This is the space kind of under the memorial, and then this is the view. This is the portal window that looks out to memorialize where Sean was killed. And then it's become, because there was no marathon memorial, it's become a place, I think, for many to gather on the anniversary of the bombing, many of the families. And the last small element we included was a series of point lights in the ground. Because the memorial we wanted to last forever. The landscape, like the trees, would transform seasonally, but we wanted to figure out how to mark an exact moment in time. And so the point lights are the constellation of stars the night Sean was shot, mapped down onto the ground. So the project, I think, I feel like if you get to do a meaningful project more than once in your life, you're really lucky as an architect. And the Memorial for Enslaved Laborers, I think, is an incredible project to be part of because of this context and the people that I'm working with. So, we hear often that UVA has this complex history. It has an incredible history, a really important history to the founding of the nation. It's a beautiful campus, part of the UNESCO World Heritage Site, and that history is part of its cultural context, its lore, and its draw, I would say, for its students and for its alumni and for everyone here on grounds. And we'll get to this in a second, but Mabel Wilson shared this map, which I think all of you are familiar with, but for me, I was completely unfamiliar with this beautiful drawing, Tanner Boyer's map. And she said this is the first representation of slavery at the university. And if you zoom in, you see this caregiver with a child. And for me, what's maybe most meaningful about this project is that I have had an opportunity to learn a lot. Not only learn history, but learn about, I would say, rules of engagement in a much deeper way than I had previously thought I had the capacity to do. So we know that there were approximately 4,000 enslaved persons working on the grounds between 1817 and 65. And our team, we're again really fortunate. Frank Dukes, who's here on faculty and developed an amazing course called Race and Repair. Greg Bleem, who's an incredible landscape architect. Mabel Wilson here in Charlottesville, and Mabel Wilson, who's an alumnus of your program and a really important scholar of American history. And Eto Otutigbe, who is an artist in Brooklyn. So this is the design team, but we are working with an incredible team on the UVA side as well. Alice, Mary, and Sarita are here. And I think the rules of engagement for this project were very vague to us in the beginning, in that typically projects have schedules, program brief, site, and budget. We had a very challenging, I would say, program brief, but no site and no budget. but instead a charge to truly, and I think this is incredible, to truly work with the community, both UVA, the President's Commission on Slavery Committee, as well as the UVA more general community, as well as the Charlottesville community and the descendant community, to develop a proposal for this memorial for enslaved laborers. And what's incredible about this history is this history actually starts, I think, here in this school with students developing the competition initially, faculty, Phoebe and Michael being involved, to initiate the conversation about this history that had yet to be completely unearthed and shared. And then, of course, this incredible context of Jefferson's landscape, right? His university, which I think is a masterwork of architecture, clearly, but has its own rules of agenda, rules of engagement embedded within the architecture, right? So you see the lawn and the hotels facing the lawn, and then these lower levels that face the gardens where much of the work was happening. And so the architecture mediates both front of house and what we could call back of house in that time period. And so much was hidden or present, but masked in terms of one's daily sight, I think, for many students and faculty. So the project began by testing multiple sites, and each site had different parameters, and then different scales of memorial ideas emerged. And we went into it saying that we're not going to get attached to any single idea, that we are going to use architecture or these sketches, these representations, in order to start conversations so that we can learn about these more underlying values, desires, goals from the community. And I have to say, like, where we felt most comfortable in the beginning were around the more ephemeral approaches to the memorial. So, you know, could we plant the lawn and have crocuses bloom seasonally? Or could we distribute the memorial and create a distributed memorial that would be literally embedded within the architecture across grounds, since the enslaved participated and helped build many of its structures. But what we were hearing was that it had to capture a different quality, that there had to be the story of suffering, but also that of strength, and so resiliency, and looking back in history to kind of kinds of activities like the Hush Harbor or the Brush Arbor, where the enslaved would find respite from their masters and have their own space of gathering and community. And also these activities like the ring shout, where song and dance were part of their culture and a way of mediating their situation, their horrific situation. So the final site ended up being in the Triangle of Grass after we did all of these tests and spoke to the community. And the reason that location, I think, ended up being the one people felt most strongly about was that it was kind of at a hinge point or a nexus. Like, we heard that some members of the descendant community feel uncomfortable coming onto the grounds. And so could it be at its more public interface? And then also, could it be tied to really the so not a destination in and of itself, but really tied to a memorializing event, so Freedom Day. And so on Freedom Day, there's a walk from the kind of slave auction block then to the campus, and then passing the site for the memorial, and then use the memorial itself as a place that then connects to other elements of the history telling of slavery on the grounds. And for us, the name came from the students, just seeing this banner, "Let Freedom Ring." When we saw that, we said, that's the memorial. It is Freedom Ring, and thus the idea to create a space for gathering, like the Hush Harbor, or that could enable such a thing like a ring shout and a gathering, kind of nestled in the landscape as you walk up the triangle of grass. The idea was that in scale it would be of the same diameter of as the rotunda, but instead of being kind of in an enclosed sphere, it would be an open bowl. And that in that simple geometry that we would have to achieve through one architecture, or a synthetic architecture, a space of gathering, a way to honor the enslaved, a way to kind of give a portrait or a picture of that moment in time, as well as tell the history of enslavement in our local and larger history. So we imagined this kind of space that has a grassy center, a timeline, we call the water table, and then an inner wall. And we wanted the inner wall to reflect the honoring of every individual enslaved person. And one of the greatest challenges is that part of the violence of slavery is also embedded in the, I would say, erasure of its history. And so because the enslaved were property, on one hand there's incredible detailed logs, but not necessarily of their identity or humanness, but of their labor. And then there's a lot of missing information. So we only know about 17% of the enslaved. And to make it even more complicated, while 963 individuals are recorded in these logs, and 652 of them have partial or full names, there are 311 unknown that we know were here, but we don't know their identity in any way. How do we represent them? And so this gives a sense of the kind of archival research here done at UVA, and Mabel has been working through this with the scholars to understand the kind of scale and magnitude, and the question of how do we represent what we do not know. So we decided to create a memory mark for every individual that we estimate through the kind of scholarship of historians on this wall, and then to create the kind of 963 inscriptions. And even in this process of the last 2 years, this number keeps changing. There have been 2 additional names, I think, discovered. And then the kind of larger estimate has, after more debate, been reduced by the scholars. And so this is an active living history. So the memory mark, there'll be about 4,000 of these. And then where we know an individual's name, it will be written above the memory mark. and where we have a record of what they contributed to the grounds, we will list their skill or contribution, and then we will also list their kinship. So I think this interior, the conversations that we've had and the debates that we've been part of and listened to have been really illuminating about this period of American history. In addition, I think the community, the Charlottesville community, felt really strongly that there should be a representation of enslavement. So a sculpture of an enslaved person, a portrait of an enslaved person. And for us, it was very challenging because there was a question of, well, which, how do we pictorially represent this in an adequate way? And so working with Eto, the artist, we mined history a bit as well as mining the conversations with the community. So you can see like this gravestone, the kind of gouge, rough surface of this tombstone, as well as Ida's tombstone, and you can see like someone over a lot of time, I think, dot to carve in this name here on an enslaved gravestone. So the blocks we're using come from Culpeper. They're the Virginia Mist stone. And they have that quality of both being wispy and being able to be treated in a really rough way. Eto was able, I think, in his many conversations with the community, hear and translate what he heard into an approach. His own work looks at, this is a Benin a statue with the kind of beauty of scarification, and then in the middle, of course, the kind of horror of scarification, and then Eto's work where he does this kind of photo V carving where he takes representations and then he materializes them in physical form. And the conclusion was that the only representation we have that is of fidelity that we could use would be Isabella Gibbons, who was enslaved and then freed and then stayed to become an educator. And maybe the way the exterior of the memorial was treated, it could actually layer all of these qualities, like the beauty, the roughness, the scarification, the horror, and then also these kind of haunting eyes of Isabella Gibbons. So we used Eto's technique of photo V carving, which, if you don't know, basically by the depth of the carving, it creates a optical register from a certain vantage point where you can see a figure. So this is, I think you can see the eyes at a certain moment appear in the stone. And so this depends on the careful kind of calibration of the depth. And so we did a kind of mock-up to see if we could see the eyes. And it worked, but we felt like it was still missing something. It was still missing this character of the time. And so we developed a technique to basically gouge the blocks, roughen the blocks, and then overlay this photo V carving on top. And then we did a kind of series of tests. We did some out of, white foam on our roof in Boston to see if we could register this, both the roughness and the kind of refined moment where you can see the eyes. And then tried to test that in stone. This is Eto. He didn't do this by hand. This was machined. And then even in the selection of the fabricator, it was a test, like the rules of engagement in order to qualify to do this memorial. They had to produce a block that then we would laser scan and see how accurate it was, because as rough as it is, you have to have that one moment where those eyes become hauntingly clear. So this was one fabricator's mock-up scan test. This was another fabricator's scan test. We went with this fabricator. And these are the mock-ups right now in Wisconsin. So you can see the kind of scallop, and at a certain angle and in a certain light, you only see or register the scallops. This is the same mock-up, different light, and you can slightly different angle, and you can see one of the eyes or pupils come into view. For us, the scale is also really important. It has to be able to gather a crowd of people, but it also has to feel really intimate and personal if you're there. So this is a kind of scale drawing in our studio, which then translates into a scaled section, which then translates into a scaled mock-up that we can kind of test all of these things. And the last element is this timetable, where the kind of history of enslavement will be, at the university, will be carved into this water table, and then there will be a thin film of water running over that. And so you are well aware that the last couple of years has been very intense in Charlottesville, and it's been, on the main stage around the history of the nation, as well as the white nationalist coming to your grounds, quite literally, and surrounding Thomas Jefferson, and the rules of engagement in terms of the kind of publicness and access to the grounds, I think, is something that this gathering created. Trying to choose my words carefully. But we see quite evident in all of our public spaces how these more subtle forms of intimidation and racism persist. So this is all the Confederate monuments across the United States, and you can see where they are, as well as courthouses named after slave owners. And then if you look at when these Confederate monuments were built, of course the majority of them were built and erected in important public spaces, government spaces, during the Jim Crow era. And so the question of what we do with our Confederate monuments, I think many here have been very actively engaged in that debate and conversation. And the students also have been actively engaging that debate. So I want to conclude with one last image. so this was, I think, a year ago, gathering around, and we hope in 1 year's time we will also be gathered in a circle around the memorial. Thank you. Yeah, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Meejin. We'll open it up for questions. I don't know if there's a roving mic around. Oh, okay.
Thank you for the presentation. I was wondering, by the time that you came onto the project, did you have to have a lot of interaction with UNESCO about how this was going to interface with the site? And if so, if you could talk about if that was an interesting process or
Yeah, so I don't know if Mary's here. Is Mary here still? Yeah, so Mary, feel free to answer the question more extensively. But yes, there was interaction with UNESCO, and I think Mary had to write a few letters in French.
We did have a question from the National Park Service when they read some of the great publicity that this project received after our Board of Visitors approved the concept back in 2017 in June. And so they, the National Park Service is our liaison with the World Heritage Center in Paris. They wanted to know if we had gotten permission from them to put the memorial within the World Heritage boundary. And we said, gulp, we didn't even think of that, actually. So, no, we had not. And so they said, well, you better write to them and try to explain where this project is and that you're not finished with it yet, and there's still time for their input. And so we did that, and they wrote back and said, we would like you to prepare a heritage impact assessment to demonstrate to us that you are not removing or detracting from the qualities that give this place universal value for the World Heritage Site, which is all based on the connection to Thomas Jefferson. So they wanted us to explain how the memorial reflected Jefferson's design aesthetic and traditions, and how it fit within Jefferson's picturesque landscape aesthetic, which didn't exist here anyway, but was their interpretation of the history. So with my the able assistance and constant hard work of my neighbor here, Meg Kennedy, who wrote this the second ever American-produced historic impact assessment, we managed to convince them that we were enriching the story and adding context to the original ideals for which the place had been recognized by UNESCO. And you know, this process took about a year, during which we were continuing to design and hire a contractor and planning to build the memorial. So we were glad that it came out well in the end.
Any other questions? Comments?
So thank you for an amazing lecture. The work's all great. I really appreciate you speaking a lot about sort of the process of conceptualizing and developing the work. And so I actually had a question in relation to that with sort of the title of your lecture, because I believe it was called Signal to Noise, which I found an interesting choice because I think so much of what you spoke about was the process by which your concepts were sort of clarified and made more simple and you know, more understandable in some ways to people. And so one could almost interpret them as sort of the reverse of that phrase, of like a noise to signal. And so I just wonder if you could speak a bit about that relationship.
Yeah, I think that's right. So we're working on a publication called Signal to Noise, and it's kind of based on our reflection that because there is so much noise, how important that signal is, and how to make signals resonant or apparent at different both levels of fidelity and also in different contexts. Yeah, I think it's like the Marshall McLuhan 2.0 in our understanding of architecture now. And so I think before we thought signal to noise quite literally, technologically, and I think the memorial here at UVA demonstrates that some of those signals or messages are very much embedded in what we do as designers and architects still today, in how they tell stories and tell histories and make it a experiential, have an experiential impact to get that signal through. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks for a great lecture. Given that you've done 2 memorials that had such a deep community engagement, has that changed how you accept projects from here on forward as an architecture firm, the kinds of projects you do, the kind of community engagement you want to be involved with? You said that it changed you. How has that kind of changed the way that you work as a firm?
You know, interestingly enough, I think it changes the way we even think about our like commercial projects or developer projects, you know. And maybe it's sort of in our attitude anyways, but I've never skillfully been able to force a project on anyone. So I think over time the work is always a mediation or a negotiation, and I think now there's in our work maybe true belief that the process makes the project better. And maybe there were earlier periods in our architectural career where we feared, let's say, we feared like having constraints or community or different opinions left and right. Like, how do we sort through that? And feeling more comfortable in that terrain, and knowing that there is a way to synthesize, and everyone knows it when they see it. Might be a little unclear on that path, but having the confidence to feel it's possible to achieve. I think it's really hard to enter a project when you think it's dauntingly impossible, and I think especially if you're a, let's say, introverted designer or architect versus extroverted, I think synthesis takes longer time. And I think what's amazing about some of these projects, the memorial projects in particular, is the powers that be know this. Like the leaders of these institutions and the university team knows this, and they build it in to that timeline and the process, so it makes it possible. If this had been, like, let's say, a 6-month design process, we wouldn't have been able to like listen and hear many conflicting things with the affirmation that it would end up okay when done. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much.